My name is Scott, and I've been painting minis for over 2 decades, and today I'm joined by Paul.
Hi, I'm Paul, and if I'm here, who's flying the plane?
Today I'm going to teach Paul one of the most important techniques in our hobby. Basically, every blending method you've ever heard of is so much harder if you don't understand the skill of layering. I'm going to show you and Paul today why that is. Are you ready for a life-changing experience?
I've had a few, but I think I could do with another one.
All right, sounds good. I'm gonna blow your mind! We're gonna paint some orcs from Paul's 40K army, and we're gonna work on their skin today from start to finish. These guys have so many muscles, which would be a great chance to showcase some layering and answer any questions Paul has. Here's an example from Paul's collection that we'll be using as our inspiration, and we're gonna start with our wet palette. So the first thing we have to set up is our wet palette. This is going to ensure that we get the most consistent results that we possibly can. So the first step is to have as much water in your palette as you can. You kind of want to see it around the perimeter, like kind of, there's too much water for the sponge to hold.
Okay.
Next, put your paper down and it's gonna want to curl in on you. Use like a flat edge to keep it down, but also to continually smooth and stretch out the paper. Mm-hmm. In some cases, the paper is a little bit too big for the palette. You want like a 1/2-inch gap around the sponge. And if that's the case, just cut it so it's a little bit smaller. In my case, I had to do that. And then it's gonna keep kind of popping up on you.
Say I'm struggle busting over.
Yeah, no, it'll keep doing it. Once both sides of the paper are like hydrated enough, they will stay down and they'll stay down forever.
This is kind of giving the same feeling as holding an Oreo under milk until all the bubbles stop.
Oh yeah, that's the technique. Now, with your paper towel, I want you to soak up any rogue droplets of water on the paper. Those are like little over-thinning landmines. Like we want to control the dilution of our paint. I don't want it to like be just random little droplets doing that for us.
Okay. You know, just you explaining this to me, I'm learning a lot as to why my wet palette sucks.
Yeah.
I thought it was just the wet palette. Nope, it's just me.
The last thing is just put like a nice little blob of water on your palette, and we'll use that to adjust the thin, nice.
Got excited.
Good job. We'll use this little blob of water to adjust the dilution of our paint. With that prepared, now we can start with our base coat. Now, a very common question with base coats and with layering is what consistency should I go for? Mm-hmm. And it's really kind of a feel thing. And I want to show you what you should be feeling for. So we have some green paint here that Paul brought that he uses on his orcs, and we'll start with that.
You mean you're gonna teach me how to feel?
Yes.
Oh, it's been so long.
A song in there somewhere. Teach me how to feel. So I've prepared a little primed piece of plastic here just to kind of demonstrate something about base coating and consistency. So we have a little blob of undiluted paint on our palette here. And one thing I want you to notice when you touch it with your brush is that it's kind of sticky. You see how the paint kind of clings to the end of the brush?
Yeah.
That's a sign that your paint is a little bit too thick. That's your first sign, okay? So now with some paint on your paintbrush, just paint like one line just down that piece of plastic card. Couple things to notice about, at least my attempt on this painting, is that you can see texture of the brush, like with that glossiness, because it is Vallejo, it's a little bit satin. You can see some brush strokes left there based on the highlights and shadows, and it kind of gets a little bit haggard here toward the end. The paint doesn't flow off the brush as nicely. Mm-hmm. So now we're gonna thin it a little bit, and the question is how much do you thin it? Well, there's one way that I like to manage my wet palette. Instead of just thinning this large puddle of paint on my palette, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make another puddle that I'm going to thin separately. Okay. This is going to allow me to have some thick stuff left behind so that I can adjust how thick or how thin this is, kind of back and forth. So if I overshoot it, I can adjust it and make it thicker. But also, this thick paint just lasts so much longer than thin paint does on a wet palette. So it's just also convenience.
You haven't seen how it interacts on my wet palette.
Oh yeah.
It does not last.
So how much to thin it? I would say just start with less than you think. You want to just loosen it a little bit. And now that it's loosened and I try to touch it with my paintbrush, I notice it isn't sticking to my bristles like anymore. It's just kind of like settling immediately.
Got that flow.
Exactly. And so now I'm just gonna paint another stripe right next to my first one. And I get flow all the way from beginning to end. There's no breakage in the line. it comes off my brush, and then once it's dry, we'll also see that it settles a lot more, which means that it would clog less details on your Mini. Basically, the whole goal with a base coat is you want to thin it to the point where it's going to behave, so it's going to come off the brush nicely, but also so you have as much opacity as possible, because who wants to be spending a bunch of time doing a bunch of base coats? So now that it's dry, we can see if we like rotate it back and forth here, there are no features in this line of paint. Like there's no glossiness, there's no thickness, you can't see it anywhere. It's settled really nicely. No one's going to be able to tell you a ratio for how to thin your paints. What you're looking for is a behavior. And these are the things that you should check for while you're painting before you apply paint to a Mini. Okay, with all that gone over, we're actually gonna start base coating with a different color, dark green. So when you stop using the GW method of painting for models, which is base coat, wash, highlight, 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 which is nothing wrong with that, but if you wanna do layering, you kind of start with your shadow. And that's a little tricky to do, because the question is how dark do I start? And it's hard to know exactly, but one thing that can help you is taking a look at what the mid-tone of your color is going to be. The mid-tone is basically what you want the thing you're painting to look like by the end. So in this case, we're painting orc skin, and we kind of want it to look like a, whatever Paul's model looks like in front of me here. This kind of green in general is kind of a darker green. Blue is kind of a darker color. Yellow is kind of a lighter color. And so because this green is a little bit darker, we want to start with a bit of a darker base coat. If our goal is more of a pale orc, then we'd start a little bit lighter.
And we'd be playing Lord of the Rings.
Exactly. As far as base coating best practices go, you don't want to load up your brush too much because you don't want to flood the surface of the model.
Really wish you would have said that like 13 seconds ago.
Also, you want to paint with the detail. So I see this big muscle on his arm right here. If I painted across it, I'd be scraping paint into that recess. If I instead paint with it, then I can get my brush down there and make sure nothing is pooling down there.
So I'm legitimately doing everything you're telling me not to do. So I'm just gonna wait for you to finish before I keep going. Because I was legitimately just doing that as you're like, also don't do this. I'm like, okay.
Well, I'm glad we're learning things.
That's the whole point of today.
Yeah. Now, depending on your brand, you're also probably gonna need to do a layer or two just to get full opacity, especially over black. So don't worry too much about that. When you're done base coating a part of the model, leave it alone. Don't agitate it. The thing about layering is that we're gonna apply layer after layer of color on top of each other. And if we keep doing that, each layer, it is going to develop a micro texture once we get toward the end of our layering effort. So the less you touch it and just let it dry and look ugly.
Literally everything you're saying is what I'm doing at the moment when you say
this is perfect. So yeah, just touch it and then move on. The first layers of paint aren't gonna look good. They're gonna be kind of like not covering great, and they might look a little splotchy, but that's okay. We'll just hit it with another layer or two until it's nice and opaque.
Okay. And now I know what not to do on the next arm.
Exactly. Sometimes you may get this, where the recesses are looking a little glossy and like there's paint pooling in there. That might be considered a mistake. Like you don't want it to clog up too much, but as acrylic paint dries, it tends to shrink and tighten, and so that will go away. And also at this point, if I were to touch that, it would look awful. It would I would carve up that inside there and it would look all textured and nasty. So just let it dry. Even if you think it's a mistake, it's gonna look way worse if you keep touching it. All right, time for layer 2. This will be good enough for this particular paint.
Generally speaking, I'm the kind of person who likes to bury my head in the sand as a defense mechanism.
I don't like sand.
Paycheck came in. I have zero interest in looking at my bank account right now. You're moving house soon. Shouldn't you be packing? If I never look at the calendar, that time may never arrive though. But Scott, there are hundreds of websites that store your information and sell them to people that then call you incessantly, scam you, or worse, steal your identity. I think I'm gonna go to bed now. Actually, I didn't go back to bed. I just signed up for this video sponsor, Incogni. Fortunately, I need to do very little to actually eliminate the vast majority of information on the internet so I can continue being clueless, but also responsible. Data brokers are companies that gather your personal information and sell it for profit. Companies then use this info to advertise to you, spam call you day and night, or worse, steal your identity. If you're in the US, your info might just show up on a people search website that neatly catalogs your name, birthday, address, family members, political affiliation, and more for anyone to find at any time. Neat! In some cases, insurers have used your browsing info stored on sites like this to increase your premium. Very cool! Where's that saying again? You can personally request that your info is removed from each and every one of these sites, but that would take an incredibly long time, and they also push back on your request. So instead, Incogni can just do it all for you and also do the maintenance. So when your info inevitably ends up back on one of those sites, Incogni will just remove it again. Within seconds of signing up, I had over 250 requests out to various data brokers to remove my information. And 10 minutes later, 40 of them had already been completed. Take your personal data back with Incogni. Use code Miniac at the link below and get 60% off an annual plan at incogni.com/Miniac. An annual plan makes a lot of sense considering how they actively monitor sites that continually put up your information. Using the link in the description also helps out the channel. Thanks to Incogni for sponsoring this video.
All right, we got our base coats done. Now let's talk a little bit about layering and what makes it so powerful and impactful. I have prepared slides. It's called layering.
A PowerPoint.
Yes.
Fancy.
So I have here just a circle that matches kind of the skin tone we're going for here with green. On the bottom, you see the gradation of colors we're working with from light to dark. And this is layered, so you can see the transition and you can, it's not blended at all. But immediately you get a sense of something, the direction of the light. It's obviously coming from the right side, right? Even if I'm not blending anything, that conveys something about what I'm painting.
Yeah. Is this going to be on the test?
Yes.
Okay.
Pay attention.
Dang it.
What's the difference between this slide and this next slide?
It goes to a higher or, I mean, I know that the layering is larger in area,
Okay.
but it's also brighter.
Exactly.
Okay.
If the bottom row is like 0 to 10, and the circle uses like 1 to 5, this next brighter circle uses lighter colors, and that gives you a sensation that it's a lighter green.
Okay.
So we use a different portion of that range band, but just a higher up one, and so it just looks lighter. Conversely, if we use a lower range band of colors, it just looks darker immediately. And so this allows you to kind of pick and choose what you want the thing you're painting to look like. You use a different range band of your overall contrast. So 0 to 10, we're using something darker here, and it gives us the impression that the thing we're painting is darker. Also, I want you to notice how on these darker examples, or just this one, the brighter layers of highlight are much smaller.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
And so this gets into something called the midtone. The midtone is like your middle color. If you have 5 colors, it's that middle third one, right?
Yeah.
And that's what your thing you're painting, so in this case, orc skin, is gonna end up looking like and feeling like.
Okay.
And oftentimes, that's the biggest layer of paint that you do. It's gonna cover most of the model.
Fascinating.
Fascinating. So let's keep going here. What else can you do with layering? So we go from this to this. And what does that feel like?
That feels like something's really in the sunlight.
In the sunlight, so like a stronger, more intense light?
More intensity.
Yeah. Also, there's like a very bright dot up there at the corner. Does that make you feel like anything? What does that make you feel like, Paul?
I saw you said we weren't going to do therapy today, man. It feels more pronounced,
Okay.
essentially, to me.
Okay.
Because like the other one, you can see the different layers, but that one, because it has more transitions up, it's more fleshed out.
Yeah, yeah. So one thing you mentioned is that it looks like it has a more intense light. So that's another thing you can do with layering by adding more contrast. So in this case, more layers of paint, a higher degree of brightness. You can make the character of the light feel different. You can make it feel like a spotlight.
Yeah.
Or you can make it feel like a cloudy day, more diffuse. So that's another thing that layering gives you. And if we pop to the last image here.
I don't like that.
You don't like that one?
No, I don't like that one.
But like we go from this way more intense light to something that's like, you know, a little bit more muted, has less brightness, and maybe what I was hoping you might notice is that this might look a little glossy because it's got that specular bright highlight.
Yeah.
And this might look a little bit more matte. So it's got less brightness, that big mid-tone is way large, there's less colors in the transition. So the last thing you can do with layering is you can make things look like a certain material. You can have things look shinier, look more matte, just based on the way you place your layers, how large and small you make them, and what colors you use in that layering process. So that's kind of the strength of layering, is that just with this one technique alone, you can determine so much about the model, the direction that the light is coming from, the character of the light itself, and also what the material is that you're painting.
Okay.
Now, we're not gonna like try to leverage that all today, but just know that's like something that you can work toward with layering, is that it can do all of these things. The last thing I wanna mention about layering is that basically when you're using any other blending method, whether that's an airbrush, whether that's glazing, whether that's wet blending, whether that's feathering, you're always trying to end up at this end point, right? Because if I just fuzz all of these layers, it just looks like this,
Yeah.
you know? And the most important thing is the bones of the blend, where the majority of those colors end up. Because when you're trying to figure out how to like do wet blending, could you imagine trying to figure out also where your colors are supposed to go and also messing with wet blending at the same time?
Yeah, no thanks.
Yeah. So if you get this down first,
Yeah.
and then focus on like your literal blending, it makes life a lot easier.
Yeah.
So now that we are armed with the knowledge of what layering can do, let's start doing our first layer. So in this example, you notice that it's an orb, and the shapes that are the layers are circles, right? And so similar for layers, whenever you're painting like a part of the model, you're gonna kind of mimic the shape of what it is. You know, pretty straightforward. Also, we're going to imagine a top-down light source. So all of those shapes are gonna like be rotated up toward the top side of the arm or the head, right? So instead of like, here's this big old bicep muscle right here, instead of putting the layer of paint like right in the middle of his bicep, I'm going to shift it up toward the top of his arm and paint on the top of that muscle, leaving behind the shadow below.
Okay.
All right, so let's start to do that. We're gonna just follow the shape of the individual muscles on his arm, leaving behind some of that darker undercoat.
Okay.
In terms of consistency, you honestly could just do the same consistency as the base coat. Like, there's no problem in these layers of paint being like totally opaque.
Okay.
You can also thin it a little bit more than your base coat, and then you'll get kind of more translucent layers of paint. And that can almost be like something to help you with your layering process. Like your first layer of highlights could be a more diluted version of the current layer you're working on, and the next one could be the fully opaque one. And you could like step it up and make a transition just by doing that, by using partially diluted paint and then doing a second layer of that exact same layer. So with this first layer of paint here, let's cover up like 90% of that first base coat. Especially on the upper side of the arm, we're gonna leave just little thin green lines in between each of these muscle groups. And that will help if you feel like the paint is jumping a little bit too quickly. If you make the little tiny shadows in the recesses like as small as you can. But that's a great point to bring up, is how do you know how bright to go with your layers? It's kind of a feeling. If you feel like it's hard to blend with the previous layer, you can always mix an intermediate layer to use that as a stepping point. But generally speaking, the bigger the thing you're painting, the more layers you're going to need to get a believable transition of colors. The less layers you have, the faster things will go, but also the more challenging it is to blend those colors. The more layers, the slower it is, but the more forgiving it is. So if you feel like you want an intermediate layer, go ahead and mix one right now.
Okay.
And just start with that.
I might do that because, yeah, I mean, it looks okay, but it's like,
Yeah, let me see what you got.
yeah, just on the backside there, it's just like, it jumps up really fast.
Yeah, it's looking okay.
Yeah.
I would say the one thing you want to do is you see this like forearm muscle right here. I want you to push the paint all the way up into that.
Okay.
That area.
And leave it just on the bottom. Oh, okay.
See, like kind of like that? Yeah. So we're really focusing on the top side of all these individual muscles. I find that in the beginning of layering, when you're working with darker colors, you can tend to jump faster.
Okay.
When we get brighter and brighter, that's less true. When you get brighter, you want to go a little bit slower, increase in brightness, not so quickly. So one thing also about these early layers is there's like he's got like a vein on his bicep.
Yeah.
I'm just blowing straight over that.
Yeah,
Like,
just vascular.
yeah, he's very vascular. I don't really care about small little details like that right now. I care about the bigger shapes on his arm. When we get a little bit brighter, that's when I'll start to care about those smaller details.
Okay.
Just remember, if your paint's ever feeling too thin or if it's ever feeling too thick, you have some more of that thick paint off to the side and you can adjust the dilution as necessary, which it is necessary because the paint will slowly change over time. How you doing, Paul?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I mean, with the painting.
Oh.
I don't care about you.
No, I'm doing good. I'm onto the face now, and I'm just trying to sort out where would be the points to actually like put this big layer on, because there are so many shadowed areas on the face, especially under the cheekbones.
Yeah, that's a great, yeah, so his cheek is just like super flat, right?
Yeah.
Just paint like all of that.
Okay.
And I would say keep, like, you see where his like cheek is like super sharp and angular? Like,
Yeah.
I would keep some shadow under there. And then I might keep some shadow, like there's like where his mouth muscle is like stretching open. So I might keep this area dark as well. Do you see on my camera like how?
Yeah. Oh yeah, the flaps in between.
Yeah, but otherwise I'm gonna fill in this entire cheek with paint.
Okay, cool.
And then keep just the area under the cheek dark as well. Another thing about paint is that it tends to look a little bit brighter wet, and as you're applying it, and as it dries, it gets a little bit less intense.
Yeah.
So you may feel like, holy cow, this is too bright of a layer, but just let it dry and then see how you feel after then. It is kind of a game of chicken though. You kind of want to go as bright as you can, so you're not spending forever doing a bunch of useless layers that aren't making much of an impact, but you also don't want to go so bright that it's hard to blend. But going slower does make it easier.
Okay.
So sometimes it's difficult to tell where you should put highlights and shadows, and you can do something called overbrushing to like help kind of spot where they are. So like on like his mouth here, he's got a lot of like vertically running, like, I don't know what to call them. Like
smile lines?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
But they're hard to see. And so what you can do with overbrushing is you can kind of get like not a ton of paint in your brush, just like like that amount, and then you can like run your brush lightly across the surface.
Oh,
and it'll start to leave behind the shadow of where you shouldn't be painting. And then with that as a visual indicator, then you can come in and just strengthen those layers.
That is honestly genius, and I never thought to do that. I don't know why.
Yeah, it's helpful. I'm feeling pretty good with this layer of highlight. I left behind maybe like 10% of that dark layer. This is gonna be our mid-tone pretty much. This is what we're gonna want the orc to eventually look like.
Yeah.
You're doing really good. Yeah. Crusher, hey buddy, we're making a movie here, man.
We're trying to do stuff, bud. So cute with this little bow tie.
Yeah, he's got a little bow tie. So the only thing that I might crisp up a little bit is I might push some paint more into that bicep. So
Okay.
you kind of stopped a little bit. So you want to mimic that oval shape.
Okay.
And then I think maybe you ran over a recess like right here. Crushy. On mine, I left that one behind.
Okay.
But it's a matter of taste. I don't think that's a bad thing. But yeah, push that paint more into that bicep over there. So now let's do our next layer of highlight. You have a nice pro-acryl paint here. This is one of those ranges, as well as Reaper MSP, that actually comes out of the bottle pretty thin. So you need to add much water to it to thin it down. But obviously, this is a little bit too bright when compared to our original Vallejo color that we used on the last layer. And so instead of just using this as our layer, we will mix an intermediate color.
Okay, cool.
It's hard to know how bright to go, but now that we're getting into the brighter layers, I would say be less aggressive with how bright this layer is. The lighter the color, the more challenging it is to integrate it with what you have going on currently. So,
Ooh, that's some Mountain Dew neon.
I know, it's a nice color, actually.
I love it.
It's gonna really enliven this green a little bit and also make it brighter.
Make it pop.
That last layer covered 90% of the model. Let's cover like 30% of the model now with this.
I think we can do that.
Right, so again, we're gonna make a separate pile of paint just so we like maintain a pure pile of the electric green and a pure pile of our mid-tone, so we can always go back and get them if we need them. So this color is going to change the hue a little bit because it's not just white, but because it's light, it's also going to brighten it up a little bit, which is nice for layering.
Ooh.
I have my original base tone right next to me on my palette, so I can kind of reference it a little bit. And I feel like something like that feels good. But I won't know until I actually apply paint to the model. And if I feel like I went a little bit too hard, then I can just back off.
Cool. Sounds good.
Yeah. What'd I just say?
A lot of stuff.
If you're concerned about it not looking good, be less aggressive. If you want to spend less time, be more aggressive. Mix a brighter layer.
Okay.
That feels good. And let's start and see how close we are.
All right.
I feel like I'm not going bright enough, fast enough. And so I am going to mix a bit more green into my first layer here.
I'm gonna try that little overbrush thing that you were talking about. See if I can do that without goober in it.
Yeah, so you can like kind of sight where the details are. Now here's something to think about. So this part of his arm right here is lower. It's like closer to the bottom of his forearm. But this muscle up here is higher up. And so the layer of paint that I apply to this big old muscle up here is going to be a lot bigger than down here.
Okay.
Just because this is more upward facing.
Okay.
So it's not like you applied the same size layer to every single detail. You're going to kind of modify it based on where it is. This is definitely changing the look of the skin.
In a good way.
Good. Okay, I'm glad you like it because we're getting a little further away from this painted example in front of me, which I knew was going to happen because you didn't use this color, right? This is a new color.
That's a new color.
But do you like this?
Yes.
Okay. Cool. So here's an example on his arm of where I painted a previous layer, and I did not paint it with this green layer. I connected this big forearm muscle and to his like weird elbow thing down here with the last layer. I'm not doing that here. I'm leaving behind layer 1 in between this gap and just painting the top of his elbow here and top of his forearm here. With this layer of color, our first highlight, now is when I'll start to paint the smaller details. So if you can, I will paint like the vein on his arm, leaving behind a little bit of layer number 1 so we can see the difference between where his bicep is and where his big bulging veins start.
Yeah.
Here's an example of how going less bright is gonna make a layer of paint that blends more with what you have going on, but also be less contrast. So if he wants to get to where I need to be, he's gonna have to spend more layers doing it, but it creates a more blended look. And like, we're not blending, we're just applying, opaque layers of paint on top of each other, and you still get this vibe. It kind of depends what you think is appropriate. If you're painting gaming minis, maybe you want to go brighter faster.
Yeah, because you have 30,000 of them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or if you're painting a display model, maybe you go brighter, slower. It all depends. And now you can paint inside of your previous layer to get a transition. An important thing to mention is that I tend to try to make a science out of art, and art doesn't like to do that. No. And so, you may struggle to see where your previous layer of highlight was, and you may not know how to paint inside of it. And that's all very common and very normal. So don't fret that too much. This is definitely more of a feel thing than it is like a math thing.
Yeah.
Ooh, painting orcs is fun. He's got so much character on his face.
Dude, I love orcs. They're so fun to paint.
There's just so much detail on his, and it's just not, it's easy.
Yeah.
It feels easier to paint than a normal face.
Yeah, because there's so much detail, but it's also clearly defined.
Yeah. Ooh, yeah. Okay, so what I'm seeing is I want to see a bit more highlight on his cheek area.
Okay.
And I want you to like kind of like extend it all the way to the ear.
I'm sorry, I like how you're using the other mini to point it out.
We're efficient here. But do you see how I kind of like push that highlight all the way to the ear kind of?
Yeah.
Yeah, so just like add some more highlight to his cheek, push it out a bit. What else? Maybe he's got a big bulbous chin.
Okay.
Maybe hit like a circle or two down there. So I didn't I gave him kind of a butt chin. I kept that shadow there in the middle, like one dot there, one dot there.
Okay.
All right, while Paul continues to increase his brightness, I'm gonna answer some of your questions that you gave me on the internet. How do I tell the difference between layering and blending? Are they distinct, or is it like a spectrum of techniques rather than one or the other? layering is a form of blending. It's just the same as wet blending, as glazing, as feathering, as blending with your airbrush. You can just see the steps in the layers. But if you use enough layers, when you zoom out from far away on a miniature, you'll never be able to see those layers. So they're basically all forms of blending.
So if you're going through and doing, say, your layering, what do you do if you realize that you need more in like an area here after you've already gone up more layers? Do you just reset back to that original layer and then build up on that again, or?
Yeah, I wouldn't fully reset, but because we have all these nice puddles of paint on our palette, you can very easily go back and grab the last layer.
Yeah.
And I would paint the correction that you think you need, and don't worry too much about running over the current layer of highlights, but you don't reset fully. Don't paint the whole, like,
yeah, because what I was curious about is because like right down in here, I missed kind of like in the crux right there. And I want to go back in and try to get that, but I'm like, should I even bother? Because it's not that big of a thing.
Let me see. You want like more?
Yeah, I want it to go more over the curve of that muscle.
I think it's fine.
Okay.
I don't think you need to fret too much with that particular bicep. I think it looks great.
Okay, cool.
The one thing I think you should try to do, if you can, is paint these veins with the brighter layer of green.
Okay.
But like leave behind that darker layer under them, so it seems like the veins are kind of like popping out a little bit. Like
happen.
Yeah, exactly. But otherwise, yeah, it's looking really good.
Okay, cool. Yeah, because that's kind of what I usually end up getting into the headspace of, is I'll just start like, oh, I need to fix that. I need to fix that. I need to fix that. And then I say, I know I've repainted the entire model differently than the rest of the models that I've painted.
Yeah, and actually, that's a great thing to bring up. I also feel that way. And I think with layering, what you should do is maybe you should keep those fixes for the end.
Yeah.
Like once you finish your final layer of highlight, sometimes you might realize that those mistakes you thought were mistakes aren't actually mistakes, and like you've actually fixed them along the way. Generally, that's kind of how it works out for me, at least. Here's a question I think is really good from Runaway Misfit. How do you know when you're done layering? I always don't know when I should stop or push it further. And it all kinds of depends on what's your midtone. What do you want the thing to look like that you're painting? Because you can't just keep going beyond it with highlights, because it will start to look like a different color. And so you need to figure out what you want to be the main look of the thing you're painting, and then center all your shadows and highlights around it so that you're not blowing that color out, and then work with those steps. It's also kind of an eye thing. Once you've finished painting, you might be able to identify if there's enough contrast or not. And it also depends on application. If you're playing with gaming minis, maybe you want to be more contrasty and more obvious where those muscles are. And if it's a display model, maybe you want to be more softer and more delicate. So it kind of depends on what the application is, but yeah, use that mid-tone as a guiding principle. That's going to be your biggest and most covering layer, and everything surrounding it's going to be smaller and less impactful. But you don't want to go too beyond it. I am not small. I am very impactful.
No, you are massive and and a meteor.
Here's another great question from Gong Yu Ho, which is, I know a lot of videos explain cover smaller and smaller surface with the next highlight, but how does that actually translate to a small surface like a mini? I struggle with knowing how much to add to each layer to make it look like the layers are working together rather than covering up the previous layer. I would say if you're struggling to identify like how much of each layer you need to use, maybe you're not mixing a bright enough or using a bright enough color. If you can't see like what you're working with and it doesn't feel like you're adding more paint on, maybe try to increase the brightness of that layer to the point where you can see it and you feel like, okay, now I am actually painting inside my previous layer, and I can kind of work from there. Here's a question from Max asking, should you start with the mid-tone and go up and down in value from there, or start with the darkest color and go lighter, or maybe lighter to dark? I think it's most intuitive to start with the darkest color and go lightest, because you're not trying to work around muscles and paint in shadows. It's very straightforward in a full-on base coat for your shadow, painting the raised surfaces that are upward facing for your next layer, and getting smaller and smaller. For me, that's the most intuitive, but if something feels more natural for you, definitely go with that instead. How do you stop from getting the colored watered edge when using very diluted paint layers? You have too much paint in your brush and you're washing the paint onto the model as opposed to just applying a layer of paint. Also, I would say if you are getting that effect, you're probably thinning your paint a little bit too much as well. Layering doesn't need to be super translucent. It can be. You absolutely can layer with translucent colors. It just takes a lot longer and gets you a more gradual effect. So it's more appropriate for larger subjects. Here's one thing I want to mention. On bigger volumes like his arm, you can see a pretty clear division between one layer and the next. And if you're not a fan of that and you want to fix that, just use more layers of paint because it's going to show up more obviously on the bigger volumes like this particular forearm muscle. But if you want to hide that with a technique that isn't layering, take your previous layer you just used to apply, dilute it with a little bit of water, more than you normally would for layering and base coating, dab it out in your paper towel to get rid of the excess, and then just paint that line. Let that dry once you apply that first layer, and then just keep applying that diluted layer right to the divide between the two layers until you begin to blur it. And so I'll keep applying that diluted paint right there until I soften that division. And that's a great way for you to like hide obvious layer lines when you're layering on the bigger volumes, especially like on his big arms here. But yeah, it's starting to disappear, and I can just keep doing that over and over again until it totally disappears.
Disappears.
So I can kind of tell at this stage that you are just futzing and not making any like big metric shifts.
Yep.
So we're gonna do one more highlight, and this is gonna cover like 10% of the model.
Okay.
And it's just gonna really gonna enunciate these volumes and make them pop out even more. So we're gonna, again, take that exact same bright yellow green. I feel like the pure color is too bright. And so we'll just mix some more of it into our ongoing mixture here to get our final highlight layer, and then again, cover about 10% of this mini.
Okay.
One other thing to note about highlight placement is that it's good to imagine this arm as like one long, just amorphous shape without these individual muscles on them. And so basically how that's helpful is if I want to put a highlight right here on this topmost muscle, I can put it in a similar place on all of the nearby muscles, and that can like help inform the decision about where highlight should go. So if instead of a big meaty arm, this is just one tube, there'd be a highlight that would run along this entire top part. Okay. And so I'm just gonna paint like it is one tube, skipping over these recesses and not worrying about like, say, painting the back half. As far as consistency goes for this last layer of highlights, honestly, you can just use the same consistency as the last layer, and even as a base coat, you know. You can go more diluted and again, create more of a gradual transition if you want to with multiple diluted layers of the same mixture of colors, or you can just send it and go full opacity, but still good flow. You do want the paint to come off the brush nicely, just like with our base coating step.
Okay. I kind of skipped ahead a little bit. I'm sorry. I'm onto the 5%.
Oh, okay. So you're gonna go for pure electric green. You're gonna bump it up even one more.
Yep. We're going for that Mountain Dew.
I'm inspired by Paul's final layer here. So we're gonna do a last layer of this super bright yellow green from Pro Acryl as well. It may be hard to use this bright of a color on bigger volumes like his bicep. And so you can just reserve it for the smaller details like on his face. Oftentimes the smaller details are a lot easier to add little bright points to than it is the bigger, softer volumes. Also, if you feel like a layer of paint is too bright, but you kind of want to sneak into it, you can just dilute it a little bit more, and then it'll apply translucently.
Ooh, okay.
And then you can go a little bit slower.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I think just focusing on the face.
Yeah. Yours still looks way better than mine, but.
Oh, let me kind of take a look at yours?
Yeah.
All right.
Yours is a lot smoother than mine.
Sure. So I think one difference between yours and mine with the face is that I kept our original base coat there to kind of like frame out the mouth and the lips a bit more. And also I kept a bit more of that shadow like right in this cheek right here. And a common question I get is like, how do I go back and fix layers? For that kind of thing, you could just straight up paint it in, you know?
Yeah.
So you could just take this nice dark green we have from Vallejo and just like try to sneak it right in there around that lip area. And also maybe I want some more like right here.
I don't quite know what to do from here.
Well, I think honestly, this skin is done.
Yeah.
I think this looks great. I think honestly, this is probably a bit higher effort than you would normally do for like painting an army of orcs. This is kind of more like a character skin.
Yeah.
But I think this is looking great. Like I think a lot of people would be extremely happy with this. If I had to like nitpick, like I kind of maybe want to see like the vertical lines on his mouth a little bit more. You can see how like they're a little bit more defined on my guy. And again, that's just as simple as coming back in with a dark green and just painting those lines in there if you want to. You don't even need to do that. But this is done to me. This looks great.
Cool, awesome. The fact that I have someone to say, hey, that's done, is perfect, because otherwise I will just keep going.
Yeah. I think a lot of knowing when to be done is just making a decision, setting it down, going and playing a game with it, and then kind of notating how you feel about the paint job. It's like, is that good enough for me? Do I want to be brighter? And
Is that good enough from 4 feet away?
Yeah, exactly. Right. So you kind of have to keep that mind open to it when you're playing a game or something like that.
Yeah.
Hopefully this was a helpful video about layering. That should finish up the orc skin for us. If you have more questions about the subject, leave it below and I will try to answer all of them. If you like this style of video, I have another video where I sit down with a different beginner. His name is Jimmy, and we paint an entire face start to finish answering his and your questions. I'll link it below and also at the end of this video. If you like the channel and you want to support it, there are a number of ways to do that. All things linked down below. Notably a web store, Miniac.co, where I sell my goods like my cutting mats, my t-shirts, my models, and also a Patreon, which gets you access to fun things like Discord. Subscribe or die! And most importantly, don't forget to